Welcome back everybody to Mastering 3D in Photoshop. My name is Kirk Nelson and we are winding down on this course. And we are now where we take a deeper look at depth maps. Okay, so what is a depth map? A depth map is a way of using a grayscale texture to control the actual topography of the surface. That means according to the value of gray, whether it's light or midtone or dark, the actual surface will be pulled up, left alone, or pushed down. So you can control the elevation or the rise of those polygons just by the grayscale file. We saw something very similar to this when we were working with the bump map. But the bump map is an illusion. It makes the surface appear to be sunken in or popped out, whereas the depth map actually does it. It actually changes the geometry of the mesh. Let's do a demonstration. First, let's fill our canvas with a 50% gray. And then we will use our gradient tool set to radial gradient to first create a white gradient. Switch it over and create a black gradient. Now in the 3D panel, we will create mesh from depth map and we'll just put it onto a plane. You can see you can do a two-sided plane, a cylinder, or a sphere. Be careful with these last two, especially the sphere. If you have too complicated of a depth map, it can really bog down the processing power of your computer. But let's just stick with the plane for right now and we'll hit create. Okay, so we end up with this flat plane that apparently has a mountain and a hole in it. If we try to toggle things around a little bit, you can see how the actual surface of the model has been changed. The gray area left it flat, and one side is bumped up and the other side is pushed down. Now you may also realize what the disadvantage to doing this is. By creating these actual changes to the topography of the mesh, you're creating more polygons and more triangles. So that's a lot more processing the computer has to go through. You'll probably notice that even toggling around the view of the model is not quite as snappy as it was with the other models. Just for the sake of viewing it, let's change our presets and just take a look at the wireframe. It's almost a solid black. And even looking at the vertices, you can see that in there. There's a lot of polygon information in this. Try to take a closer view. You can see there's a lot going on there. Now, if you run into a very polygonally heavy model that you're having trouble sort of moving around, here's a good trick. Go to the scene view and change your preset to bounding box. So that just gives you this lightweight square that stands in the place of that heavy polygonal mesh. Then you can move it around much easier, and when you get a position that you like, then turn it back on to the other preset that you prefer to view it at. So let's take a look at a project where this is actually rather useful. Let's start with this image of this flag. So we will use those techniques to create a depth map and make this flag look like it's a 3D flag that's billowing in the wind and it's all fluttering around and the surface of it is just all misshapen due to the depth map. Before we even start with that, I want to turn it into a regular layer and warp it some so that it does look like it's a very fabric-y and fluid looking piece of material, not a perfect rectangle. I like something probably around there. And I will save this out as flag billowed. Now I will take this same layer here and I'm going to render a cloud onto it. So filter, render, clouds, but we're also going to blur this quite a bit. Now something that I've realized about blurring a layer is if you want to keep the sides of it nice and opaque and sharp and crisp, you got to lock the opacity of those pixels with this little lock icon here. So filter, blur, Gaussian blur, crank that up nice and high. All right, now I'm going to use my gradient tool again, set to reflected gradient. I'll pull that opacity down around 50% or so. Add some areas in here. I feel like it should have some creases. You can swap back and forth between white and black. And then if you want, you can even do some spots of it as the radial gradient tool. Let's add one over here, a little darker spot. It got a little bit bright on that side. So now we got a nice uneven grayscale image here. So let's go to our 3D panel, mesh from depth map to plane, hit create. And we end up with this very uneven piece of material here that does actually look quite a bit like it could be a billowing flag. It does look a little bit too exaggerated though. So if we grab that depth map area there and scale it along the Z It'll help to sort of flatten it down a little bit so it won't be quite as exaggerated. Now, this technique works really well if you're trying to create a landscape or some sort of terrain. In fact, if you can get some great topography maps, you can actually create places that are represented by real land masses here on Earth. That's really a great application for this technique. Now, something that I did notice that I think is a little bit odd is that it gives an opacity map to it when you map this. And that opacity map is also that same depth map. So let's blow that away if I remove texture. And that should actually help speed up a little bit of the responsiveness. And then on the diffuse, which again is set to the same depth map, now let's replace that texture with that flag billow. And we get a pretty neat looking fabric-like flag that does actually look like it's billowing in the wind. And one of the advantages of that topography being true and not an illusion like with a bump map is it can create accurate shadows. And you see in the top level here, it's an accurate mesh. So the advantage to using a depth map is a higher degree of accuracy. That accuracy comes at a price. It's often difficult to work with the meshes because they can tend to be rather heavy. Alright guys, so the depth maps is something that can be useful, but it's one of those isolated incidents and only in specific situations where you find that you'll ever actually use that. But regardless, it's a feature that's in there, it's a feature that can be useful, and it's worth knowing about. Likewise, with our next one, which is also the last feature to demonstrate in this course, it's the 3D paint system. See you next time.